Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am Drew Armstrong, the executive editor of Endpoints News, and welcome to Post-Hoc Live. We are streaming and recording this on July 17, and today we're going to be talking about space. So, for almost as long as I've been a biopharma journalist, I've been reading news stories about people shooting biotech experiments into orbit. And if I'm honest, I really hate those stories. They are full of hype. They never live up to the often boring and sometimes negative results of the experiments. And they are, I am really sad to say, sometimes just bad tech and science journalism. And that has unfortunately turned me into a low information drugs in space skeptic, a description that I found matches a lot of people out there. And I have to say, I want to believe. I grew up firing SD's model rockets as a kid. I love watching rocket launches by SpaceX. I have a bookshelf full of space colonization sci-fi. But for years, drugs in space has felt like one big long hype cycle that never gets into orbit. So last week, when Varda Space Industries announced that they had raised $187 million to start industrializing bioprocessing in low Earth orbit, I gave them a call. I wanted to hear what they were going to do with the money, how microgravity chemistry could be useful at scale, and to push them on whether this time drugs in space is for real. Now, just a little bit of housekeeping for those of you who are joining us on YouTube today. Hit that little subscribe button below the screen. You'll get notifications when we have a new live stream coming up. And if you're tuning in late, recordings are going to live on our channel on YouTube and then later today on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Just search us for Post Hoc Live. Now, for today's episode, I'm going to be joined by our senior science correspondent and fellow drugs and space skeptic, Ryan Cross. Ryan and I are going to be speaking with Varda's chief science officer, Adrian Radocea, who is a firm drugs and space believer about what the company is up to. And he is going to try to turn us into believers as well, that this time drugs and space is really happening. Adrian, Ryan, welcome to Post Talk Live. Thank you guys both for being here. Adrian, all right, I have given my big kind of semi-sarcastic intro here, and I want to ask you, like, am I justified in having been for a long time kind of deeply skeptical about, I think, a lot of the way, at least that this gets kind of covered and presented in the headlines and things like this? Because this really does feel like I've been reading the same story for like 20 years and not seen a lot. Like, should I be the low information drugs and space skeptic that I am?
I just love the way you see it because when we started this company, we saw exactly what you're seeing. And it's a product of how industry works, how academia works, how national labs work. And if you think about it, here on Earth, we have millions, hundreds of millions of people working in industry, advancing products. In space, you've had a handful of astronauts. So in terms of man years of effort, the scale is so different. Nonetheless, what we've seen is some of the fundamental science poke through and start to connect with that application layer. And we're seeing big pharma and many others actively involved. We've also found that NASA has been quite collaborative. So when we point out these issues and these challenges, we are seeing them very positively respond and push their own internal initiatives further and further than they have before. So we absolutely see definitely what you've been seeing. We're excited to bring an industry lens to the sector, and we're pretty happy with how the community has been receiving that.
And why don't you just, I mean, will you tell me, I know you're a materials science engineer. Will you talk to me, how did you end up at a space company? And then just, give me the kind of 30-second version of like what you guys do exactly and how it's different.
Yeah, so my background is material science and engineering. I got recruited to Varda to figure out what are the right materials to make in space and why, and really mapped out all the sectors from semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, ag tech. And we really took this industry approach of figuring out what are the industry needs, how do those value chains work, where are the opportunities, and then we stack ranked, and pharma quickly rose to the top as the place where we can have the biggest impact.
Why is that? I mean, I think, like why pharma as opposed to so much else? Like, explain this to me from why does this make sense as a business
Yeah.
to be doing it in the drug industry?
So the first place to start with is really with the need. Something like disease and medicine is so impactful to people. If you can help patients have better lives, that's a lot better than making their chips cost 10%, 20% less. And so the impact that you can have in pharma is so large. That's really the first part of it. And then the other aspect is that developing a medicine is expensive. It takes many years, large investments, clinical trials, and as a result of that, you can absorb costs in the pharma sector better than in other sectors, and you have these high value products where an emerging technology such as space, the cost is coming down, but it's going to take some time. It's a great place to start. You penetrate in pharma, and then you slowly expand out to other verticals.
I'm guessing that there are probably not too many other molecules that humans make that are as valuable, like per gram or per unit, as pharmaceutical products. And it sounds like that has a big role in why you started there. Is that right?
Absolutely. Dollars per kilogram is a great metric for the space sector, and there's a nice mapping over to pharma. I think you could argue that there are some industries that have found great ways to keep the price of their chemicals high. Printer ink is one of them that comes to mind, but it doesn't have that big impact for
Yeah.
society. So pharma is really, really exciting because yes, you have the financial, but it's also important for the world.
So where did this idea come from to begin with? Like who first thought, let's send our drugs up to space and make them or formulate them there? Like why did someone think that that was a good idea to
Yeah,
begin with?
that's a great question. A lot of this started long ago. There was the Skylab, the Mir space station. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, Johnson and Johnson was flying protein on the in space. They were doing shuttle experiments. So this has been around for a long time. And the reason people thought about it is they looked at where are the biggest manufacturing challenges, where are the things we want to do that we just can't do because of the limitations.
Hmm.
And in the early days of biologics, dealing with something like purification and separation, that was a really big challenge in those days. So they just thought, okay, what can we try? What can we do? At that time, the space technology was even then it was really starting to change, and they thought, okay, let's just try and see what could happen up there. So the idea has been around for a long time, but what wasn't possible is access to space at a cost that would make sense. You would have to plan these things 5 years out. That doesn't really work for industry. You want to have improvements quarter to quarter. You want to turn things around as fast as you can, and that's what Varda does. We have these high cadence, low cost reentry vehicles. So we're taking things that were ideas, potential, and we're making them economically viable.
Just so I understand this right, like, are you guys basically just like renting space on a SpaceX flight, sending up your capsule? I assume it orbits around the Earth a few times. Like what
Yeah.
happens? Like walk me through the actual like you put it on the rocket and then
Yeah, it's really incredible. So we buy a seat on a transport mission. We're one of 40 to 100 satellites that go up. We get dropped off in low Earth orbit. We stay there as long as we need to do the microgravity processing. So, for example, we'll launch, we'll stay up there for 1 to 2 months, carry out everything we need to do in that mission, and then we re-enter. And what's really special about Varda is that we come back on land. So we're able to recover our samples without having to deal with moisture or losing something in the ocean. And we really make it seamless. So when we work with pharma companies, we have that fully integrated space capability. We don't build our own rocket, but we build the capsule, the spacecraft, the process equipment inside. We even develop processes. We have a built out biotech space and staff from Amgen, Merck, Genentech, Resilience. We are able to run the process development at the standard the industry needs to really make it easy for people to work with us. So if they have a molecule with a formulation challenge, they can come to us and we can do everything end to end to deliver a solution to them.
there's this, in the circles that you guys operate in, there's this well-known study of like people, with Kruda, where people crystallized Kruda in space, and there's talk about how it got them closer to a subcutaneous formula and so on and so forth. I'm wondering, like, is that kind of the prototypical example of what you guys are doing? And I'm sure Ryan is going to have some microgravity,
Yeah.
chemistry questions for you. But like, when we think about like, yeah, like what you guys are doing and what industry wants, and like like I've read and talked to people about like how like getting crystals is really hard and things like like this is
Yeah.
like a well-known thing. But can you like, is that kind of the like prototypical like use case for what you guys are doing? And can you maybe talk a little bit about that and then how that applies to other aspects of the business you guys are trying to build?
Yeah, an incredible place to start, and it really is the strong prototype to start with. So the context there is today a lot of biologics are administered as an intravenous infusion. The patient might have to go to the hospital. It's kind of like that scene in Breaking Bad where Walter White is sitting in the chair, and the there are a lot of times where that really changes your life. You no longer have the freedom to go to work when you want. You can't go to things the way you want to do. It can really just be disruptive, and you already have the disease, but managing the disease is also difficult. What patients want and what doctors are trying to make accessible are subcutaneous injections that can be self-administered or administered quickly so the patient doesn't have to be there as long. The office can see more patients. When people try to make those formulations here on Earth, they often run into problems. As you push up the concentrations, the proteins come closer and closer together. They crowd, they interact. It can start to turn into molasses, and you can no longer push it through the syringe. So, what was brilliant, the work that Merck showed, is that if you crystallize the antibody and you do so in space, you can keep that viscosity low and get to that high concentration formulation for subcutaneous injection. We would love to do that here on Earth. The challenge with protein is as you start to scale up that process, gravity gets in the way. So you have to keep the molecule suspended, you have to keep everything uniform. Here on Earth, because of sedimentation, that's not so achievable. And while we have technologies like stirring and impellers, we can use that in some cases, but for something like a protein, you're now shearing apart the crystals, so it doesn't work. There's no way to really scale up those technologies on Earth, and that's where microgravity steps in. It's all about taking these crystallization processes and making them commercially viable.
So maybe just to walk us through what this actually looks like. So I think we're all familiar with uh, gravity and its sometimes undesirable effects on us, right? But it's just a fact of life here on Earth. And I wonder what are we able to actually observe in terms of gravity's effects on these molecules? Are scientists actually looking at how these molecules are sort of stacking up in this formulation and saying, oh, gravity's getting in the way again. If only we didn't have gravity. Like what does this actually kind of look like on a molecular level, in terms of how those molecules are being packed together in the gravity environment of Earth versus the microgravity environment of space?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I mentioned the viscosity and being needing to be able to push the dose through the needle. That's really the critical performance parameter of like what viscosity can you achieve at the concentration that's needed for the sub-Q formulation. So when you start with IV and you want to switch to sub-Q, you're changing the concentration often by 20 times because you want to fit everything in 1 to 2 mils or less. What happens on the molecular scale and in the crystallization process is there's this driving force for the molecules to come together, and when they do so, you have these no longer just molecules in solution, but you have these crystals. The surface area to volume ratio is different, so the amount of contacts drops. So the
Hmm.
crystal lets you get to that high concentration while minimizing surface contacts, which drops the viscosity. And then if we want to think about microgravity versus crystallization on Earth and what changes, it's really at the macroscopic scale. At the molecular scale, how atoms bond, what's favorable, the thermodynamics is the same. The crystal structure you get in space will be similar sometimes to the crystal structure that you can get on Earth. The difference is how those crystals grow. So while where the molecules want to go can be the same, how they get there can be vastly different in space because you're looking at how is the liquid flowing in the reactor, what is the distribution of particles and crystals as they're growing and evolving, what are the concentration gradients, and microgravity lets you completely change the way those reactors evolve over time, which enables that scale up of those processes that are hard to access here on Earth.
So just to really to back up and just ask a really
Yeah.
maybe basic question. So this is mostly about formulating drugs. This isn't necessarily like synthesizing or making the molecule for the first time. The company makes the molecule, but they're having a hard time getting it in the right formulation that they want. They send it to you, you send it up to space. Um, do you have to do that for every single injectable or pill, or are you actually manufacturing the drug at commercial
Yeah.
scale? up
Yeah,
in
this is
space,
what
or is
I
it?
was really wanted
Yeah,
to know about this
yeah,
as well. Like, is this like an industrial process or is this a development process as you guys think about where the business is?
yeah. We're definitely on the way to industrial processes, but that's not where we're starting. That the first step, it's very similar to how drugs developed on Earth. You first start with research, then you go into development, and then you scale up. And it's time to where you are in the clinical development of that program. So when you talk about industrial processes, there's two categories. There's maybe everything that you do to make the formulation that's not going to people, just to characterize and understand what it is. And then when you switch over to GMP, that's when you're making materials that are going into people. So right now we're before that GMP phase, and we're demonstrating the performance of these formulations or crystals, and it's really getting the performance specs to get ready to in the future put these products into people. And then when it comes time to industrial manufacturing and scale, that's on the ramp up from clinical trials through commercial launch. And if you look at how drugs are developed, it's often a 10-year timeline. Sometimes reformulation can range anywhere from 3 years to 10 years as well. And so there's a life cycle to the activities. And you ramp up the production together with the clinical trials, and you time it for the commercial launch.
So,
Where can I ask, like space has been getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper on like a per kilogram or per ton basis. Like where are we right now on the kind of like launch cost versus weight curve as you all think about like what's viable for you to pitch to a drug maker and saying, hey, like we can run a whole bunch of stuff for you, or we can start making this drug at some level of scale. Like where are we on the launch cost curve of your as it relates to your business? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now, depending on the launch vehicle, you're able to hit thousands of dollars per kilogram, maybe $4,000 per kilogram on some of the SpaceX vehicles. And what's coming that is really going to change everything are very large vehicles such as Starship, where you start to approach hundreds of dollars per kilogram. And when you look at drugs, like the price of a vial of something like Kruda, there are rebates and it's more complex, but the price you might see online could be something like $20,000 for a vial that has a couple hundred milligrams of product. And so when the launch costs are at thousands of dollars per kilogram and the price of the product is tens of thousands for a couple hundred milligrams, there's just a lot of room in that cost structure to absorb space costs today already. And so what we're really focused on is the kind of the same place you started of, hey, let's really show this and make this absolutely clear around the benefit, what's different. And that's what we've been pushing from the industry lens. And in parallel, we've also been investing very heavily in what was missing infrastructure. So you could go to space. Prior to Varda, coming back down was the bottleneck. And so we introduced the W series, which is a low cost, high cadence reentry vehicle, so that we have the turn time that's necessary to operate in industry. And over time, we're continuing to invest in our cadence. We're booked on every transporter mission through the end of 2026. And beyond that, we're going to be increasing the cadence more and more to be able to take on these efforts.
so I want to go back and ask a question about when you send something up and you figure out a new formulation, right, that works better because of microgravity. I guess I have two questions. One is when that comes back down to Earth, does it stay in that new formulation, right? Or does gravity cause it to sort of shift back to the old way? That's one question. And then secondly, if you're using that new formulation that you made in zero G is like a starting point for designing a better drug here on Earth. Like we don't have zero gravity here on Earth, right? So how do you, I guess, reverse engineer if that's what scientists are doing, from that zero G formulation to something you can actually make here on Earth?
Yeah, those are great questions. So what we make in space comes back down unchanged. And the reason for that is we're
Mm.
using microgravity during the crystal formation period. So it's not that microgravity stabilizes the thing, it's that microgravity lets us change how the fluids flow as the crystals are growing. But once the crystals are grown, those are strong bonds. Even though they're not as strong as covalent bonds within the molecule, you have hydrogen bonding, these strong interactions that hold that crystal together And the force of gravity relative to those forces is very small. But it does add up when you're at this reactor scale. You start to get convection, sedimentation, all of these challenges. And we were able to demonstrate that out of the gate on our first mission. We made the least stable crystalline form of ritonavir, and we brought it back unchanged. It re-entered Mach 25, the outside of the capsule, thousands of Kelvin, the inside of the capsule with the ritonavir, we held at 5 degrees C through touchdown. And our ability to control the temperature, the way we engineer our spacecraft, let us bring things back without any risk of it changing on the way down. And then you asked another really great question, which is, okay, so once you demonstrate this formulation, how do you translate that to an industrial process? What does that look like? There's two approaches. One approach is to use the crystals that come back as seeds to then propagate, especially for new crystal structures, new forms. And then it just looks like manufacturing here on Earth. In industry today, seeded processes are how you scale up a crystallization. So you use the space crystals as seeds to propagate. And the other
Just
one,
to pause real quick to make sure I understand that. So this is actually like taking the space crystals that you've made and then putting them in a lab here on Earth and basically getting the Earth molecules to just replicate and copy that structure that it wouldn't have been able to make otherwise. Is it really that? I'm probably oversimplifying this, but is that what you're doing?
yep, that's one of the approaches. And it very much depends on the molecule and the use case and what you're trying to achieve. When people develop, especially for small molecule drugs, the crystal structure is one of the critical things that needs to be controlled. Ritonavir is one of those famous examples where they released the product. After a couple of years on the market, the dose stopped working and they didn't know why. When they went to go look inside the capsules, they found crystals, and the crystals in those capsules were of a crystal structure they had never seen before. And it turned out that the new structure had lower solubility, which means you couldn't get the dose you needed, and they had to recall. It was devastating. This was one of the first HIV medications. Patients had hope, and then it got pulled away, and they had to wait a couple of years. So the industry takes something like crystal structure extremely seriously. And here on Earth, we do everything we can to get to the best crystal forms, understand them. But because molecules are getting more and more complex over time, that's increasingly difficult. So technologies like space are critical for the industry to be not only more thorough in uncovering all of the forms, but also accessing the best forms to make the dosage forms for those patients.
I want to ask like a big brained and potentially very stupid question, but that's my prerogative here on the show. But like, do you guys view your primary competition as other space companies, or do you view it as like AI models that are doing protein structure prediction? Because we had a great guest on the show the other day who's a machine learning engineer who works in biopharma. And like one of the things he mentioned, one of the things he said, it was very limiting for me, is like, these are just physics models. Like we put in essentially all of the modeling around physics and every the characteristics of physics, and we figure out what these things are going to do. And I presume that, like if you wanted to, you can do anything you want inside of those models with the laws of physics. And like, is that something that you guys view as competition or not really? Like, how are you guys thinking about what you're doing in parallel with all of the other really interesting developments in characterizing and developing new proteins that are out there and happening right now?
Yeah, we're very excited about those technologies. They're accelerants for the industry. When I was in the semiconductor industry, I built out a team doing data-driven materials discovery, and it's like throwing fuel in the fire. Whatever development you're doing, you can get 10, 20, 30% more out of that same spend. So the protein modeling tools help us go faster. And for something like going to space, it's really great to have an understanding of what the predictions are from the models, understanding the predicted landscape to help guide the experimental work that you do. Ultimately, we're about making the product. And I would love if a computer could 3D print the thing that we wanted to manufacture on its own, but ultimately we have to go and manufacture. And so that's a great accelerant for companies like Varda.
Can I ask one more question? And this is more of a business question for you guys. How do you find your customers? Because there's such an again, like there are a lot of biologic drugs out there and things that someone might want to crystallize. Do you guys kind of scout and say, hey, we think this is a really good candidate for us to do work on, and we're going to go and pitch this company? Or are companies coming, or how much are companies coming to you? Because I have to imagine that, like, you know there are certain types or categories of molecules that might be more appropriate for you all to do work on in microgravity than others. And so like how does the kind of customer acquisition process in that context work?
Yeah, we're very excited from the beginning with this industry focus. That's where we started. We immediately started reaching out to folks. We went to the leaders in academia and industry and science, and we just started asking, where is this? Where is the field going? What are the problems you're dealing with? And it's been a continuous conversation since we started Varda. We certainly do a lot of proactive outreach, but we also get a healthy amount of inbound as well. And like you, we're really critical and thinking through, why are we doing this? How does this work? And so when we work with partners, we do extensive testing on the ground. We first want to make sure that we have the best possible process here on Earth, so that when we do see a result in space, it's really because of space. We don't want to start with something that's half finished, show a difference, then realize, oh, we could have actually gotten there on Earth. So we work with our partners to get the best process here on Earth, and then we modulate it and enhance it with our space capability to push the envelope of what formulations are possible for patients.
Another very simple question I probably should have asked a while ago, but I assume you don't have astronauts or scientists up in
Oh, yeah.
space doing this, right? This must be all automated somehow. Can you walk us through how you do that, and if there was some innovation on that side of things as well?
Absolutely. We're completely unmanned, and that gives us a lot of flexibility in how we design our capsule. It lets us keep the cost low. And it's really applying the state of the art from the process equipment industry. Our innovation has been around really adapting the best practices for the microgravity environment. If you have a bubble here on Earth, it's not so bad. You can wait for it to float up to the top of the reactor, manage the headspace. And microgravity, that's a little different. It's a little more challenging. And so we have an incredible spacecraft engineering team. We've also integrated people from the pharma industry into our organization. And together we've been able to overcome some of the things that are different to be able to take advantage of that environment. And really, we keep things as simple as we can. And we automate the end-to-end process. We can command it from here on ground. We collect data as it happens. And it's really not that different from how process is done in industry. You have a tool that runs a recipe, you develop that recipe, you monitor it, and over time you iterate to get to the best possible results.
You guys obviously just raised a really big round of money. What are you guys going to use that for?
We're excited to continue to build out our cadence, which has been critical, as well as invest into our biotech capabilities. So we're building out a 10,000 square foot lab, and we're really excited for the partnerships that we'll be able to support with the increased capacity.
Wonder, just to jump on that, I wonder how big you think you know, formulating drugs in space company can become, because I think that this is part of the industry that's vital for any drug that gets on the market, right? These things all have to be formulated, but that's a part of the
Mhm.
science and engineering that we don't normally hear about. Journalists like myself don't normally write about it. It's kind of it's the middle phase of research, right? That is, comes after the original scientific discoveries to actually come up with what the drug is going to be, and then the clinical trials to prove that it works. There's a lot that goes on in that phase, but it's again, it's not something we normally talk a lot about, right? And I think if your company wasn't doing this in space, we might not be sitting here talking about it, right? So
Yeah.
I wonder, just a couple questions there, just how big you think the industry can be, but also if you think that's sort of a blessing or a curse, right? That you're focused on this kind of technical part of the drug development process that maybe most people don't normally think of.
Yeah, we're pretty excited. The biologic sector is growing very quickly. Small molecule drugs are continuing to launch, and so we see the overall sector, even though in the short term there can be volatility with challenges. Human health is so important, and we see very good long-term economics in the sector. And within the formulation space, that's becoming increasingly critical. There's so many new modalities that are coming out: viral and gene therapy, mRNA, biologics. all of these new types of medicines hinge on the delivery technologies. So we think that's going to be an increasingly important sector for the industry. And then there are certainly comparables. There are lots of biologics formulation companies that have demonstrated success. They haven't been able to solve all of the problems. And so Varda can step in and bring that next generation of formulation technologies.
Well, I unfortunately am going to have to wrap up our conversation there, as that is all the time we have for today. Adrian, thank you so much for spending some time with us, and good luck to you guys. Ryan, thank you as well. To our audience, if you have a great idea for a future guest or for a future topic, tell me. The recording of this conversation will live on YouTube and is also going to be on Spotify and Apple Podcasts later today. If you've got feedback on what we're doing, send me a note. I want to hear from you, and make sure you are signed up for our Post-Hoc email newsletter. You'll get special analysis from our newsroom and alerts when we've got a new broadcast coming up. To subscribe, you can go over to endpoints.news. In the top right-hand corner, hit your reader profile, preferences, and then click to activate Post-Hoc. Thank you to our producer, Nicole Wetzman, and our engineer, Dalen Turk, who make this whole thing work behind the scenes. We will see you next time news breaks. I'm Drew Armstrong for Post-Hoc Live.